Hello, and welcome to ML's Audiobooks. This channel is dedicated to filling in any of the gaps in the available audiobook forms of Marxist literature, and I hope you find this resource useful. Thank you. Today, I will be reading The Right of Nations to Self-Determination by Vladmir Ilyich Lenin. Originally published in 1914 and sourced from Lenin's collected works, published by Progress Publishers in 1972, Volume 20, pages 393 to 454. As posted on Marxists.org. Chapter 3. The Concrete Features of the National Question in Russia and Russia's Bourgeois Democratic Reformation. Quote, despite the elasticity of the principle of the right of nations to self-determination, which is a mere platitude and, obviously, equally applicable, not only to the nations inhabiting Russia, but also to the nations inhabiting Germany and Austria, Switzerland and Sweden, America and Australia, we do not find it in the programs of any of the present-day socialist parties. End quote. This is how Rosa Luxemburg opens her attack on Section 9 of the Marxist program. In trying to foist on us the conception that this clause in the program is a, quote, mere platitude, unquote, Rosa Luxemburg herself falls victim to this error, alleging with amusing boldness that this point is, quote, obviously equally applicable, unquote, to Russia, Germany, etc. Obviously, we shall reply, Rosa Luxemburg has decided to make her article a collection of errors in logic that could be used for schoolboy exercises. For Rosa Luxemburg's tirade is a sheer nonsense and a mockery of the historically concrete presentation of the question. If one interprets the Marxist program in Marxist fashion, not in a childish way, one will without difficulty grasp the fact that it refers to the bourgeois democratic national movements. That being the case, it is, quote, obvious, unquote, that this program, quote, sweepingly, unquote, and as a, quote, mere platitude, unquote, etc., covers all instances of bourgeois democratic national movements. No less obvious to Rosa Luxemburg, if she gave the slightest thought to it, is the conclusion that our program refers only to cases where such a movement is actually in existence. Had she given thought to these obvious considerations, Rosa Luxemburg would have easily perceived what nonsense she was talking. In accusing us of uttering a, quote, platitude, unquote, she has used against us the argument that no mention is made of the right to self-determination in the programs of countries where there are no bourgeois democratic national movements, a remarkably clever argument. A comparison of the political and economic development of various countries, as well as of their Marxist programs, is of tremendous importance from the standpoint of Marxism, for there can be no doubt that all modern states are of a common capitalist nature and are therefore subject to a common law of development. But such a comparison must be drawn in a sensible way. The elementary condition for comparison is to find out whether the historical periods of development of the countries concerned are at all comparable. For instance, only absolute ignoramuses are capable of, quote, comparing, unquote, the Russian Marxist agrarian program with the programs of Western Europe, since our program replies to questions that concern the bourgeois democratic agrarian reform, whereas in the Western countries no such question arises. The same applies to the national question. In most Western countries, it was settled long ago. It is ridiculous to seek an answer to non-existent questions in the programs of Western Europe. In this respect, Rosa Luxemburg has lost sight of the most important thing, the difference between countries where bourgeois democratic reforms have long been completed and those where they have not. The crux of the matter lies in this difference. Rosa Luxemburg's complete disregard of it transforms her verbose article into a collection of empty and meaningless platitudes. The epoch of bourgeois democratic revolutions in Western continental Europe embraces a fairly definite period, approximately between 1789 and 1871. This was precisely the period of national movements and the creation of national states. When this period drew to a close, Western Europe had been transformed into a settled system of bourgeois states, which, as a general rule, were nationally uniform states. Therefore, to seek the right of self-determination in the programs of West European socialists at this time of day is to betray one's ignorance of the ABC of Marxism. In Eastern Europe and Asia, the period of bourgeois democratic revolutions did not begin until 1905. The revolutions in Russia, Persia, Turkey and China, the Balkan Wars, such is the chain of world events of our period in our, quote, Orient, unquote. and only a blind man could fail to see in this chain of events the awakening of a whole series of bourgeois democratic national movements which strive to create nationally independent and nationally uniform states. It is precisely and solely because Russia and the neighboring countries are passing through this period that we must have a clause in our program on the right of nations to self-determination. But let us continue the quotation from Rosa Luxemburg's article a little more. She writes, quote, "In particular, the program of a party which is operating in a state with an extremely varied national composition and for which the national question is a matter of first-rate importance, the program of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, does not contain the principle of the right of nations to self-determination," unquote. Thus, an attempt is made to convince the reader by the example of Austria, quote, "in particular," unquote. Let us examine this example in the light of concrete historical facts and see just how sound it is. In the first place, let us pose the fundamental question of the completion of the bourgeois democratic revolution. In Austria, this revolution began in 1848 and was over in 1867. Since then, a more or less fully established bourgeois constitution has dominated for nearly half a century, and on its basis a legal workers' party is legally functioning. Therefore, in the internal conditions of Austria's development, beginning parentheses, i.e., from the standpoint of the development of capitalism in Austria in general, and among its various nations in particular, end parentheses, there are no factors that produce leaps and bounds, a concomitant of which might be the formation of nationally independent states. In assuming, by her comparison, that Russia is in an analogous position in this respect, Rosa Luxemburg not only makes a fundamentally erroneous and anti-historical assumption, but also involuntarily slips into liquidationism. Secondly, the profound difference in the relations between the nationalities in Austria and those in Russia is particularly important for the question we are concerned with. Not only was Austria for a long time a state in which the Germans preponderated, but the Austrian Germans laid claim to hegemony in the German nation as a whole. This, quote, claim, unquote, as Rosa Luxemburg, parentheses, who is seemingly so averse to commonplaces, platitudes, abstractions, end parentheses, will perhaps be kind enough to remember, was shattered in the War of 1866. The German nation predominating in Austria found itself outside the pale of the independent German state which finally took shape in 1871. On the other hand, the Hungarians' attempt to create an independent national state collapsed under the blows of the Russian serf army as far back as 1849. A very peculiar situation was thus created, a striving on the part of the Hungarians and then of the Czechs, not for separation from Austria, but, on the contrary, for the preservation of Austria's integrity, precisely in order to preserve national independence, which might have been completely crushed by more rapacious and powerful neighbors. Owing to this peculiar situation, Austria assumed the form of a dual state, and she is now being transformed into a triple state, beginning parentheses, Germans, Hungarians, Slavs, end parentheses. Is there anything like this in Russia? Is there, in our country, a striving of the, quote, subject peoples, unquote, for unity with the great Russians in the face of the danger of worse national oppression? One need only pose this question in order to see that the comparison between Russia and Austria on the question of self-determination of nations is meaningless, platitudinous, and ignorant. The peculiar conditions in Russia with regard to the national question are just the reverse of those we see in Austria. Russia is a state with a single national center, Great Russia. The Great Russians occupy a vast, unbroken stretch of territory and number about 70 million. The specific features of this national state are, first, that the, quote, subject peoples, unquote, beginning parentheses, which, on the whole, comprise the majority of the entire population, 57%, end parentheses, inhabit the border regions. Secondly, the oppression of these subject peoples is much stronger here than in the neighboring states, beginning parentheses, and not even in the European states alone, end parentheses. Thirdly, in a number of cases, the oppressed nationalities inhabiting the border regions have compatriots across the border who enjoy greater national independence, beginning parentheses. Suffice it to mention the Finns, the Swedes, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Romanians among the western and southern frontiers of the state, end parentheses. Fourthly, the development of capitalism and the general level of culture are often higher in the non-Russian border regions than in the center. Lastly, it is in the neighboring Asian states that we see the beginning of a phase of bourgeois revolutions and national movements which are spreading to some of the kindred nationalities within the borders of Russia. Thus, it is precisely the special, concrete, historical features of the national question in Russia that make the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination in the present period a matter of special urgency in our country. Incidentally, even from the purely factual angle, Rosa Luxemburg's assertion that the Austrian Social Democrats program does not contain any recognition of the right of nations to self-determination is incorrect. We need only open the minutes of the Brünn Congress, which adopted the national program, to find the statements by the Ruthenian Social Democrat Hakenowitz on behalf of the entire Ukrainian in parentheses Ruthenian delegation, and by the Polish Social Democrat Rieger on behalf of the entire Polish delegation, to the effect that one of the aspirations of the Austrian Social Democrats of both the above-mentioned nations is to secure national unity and the freedom and independence of their nations. Hence, while the Austrian Social Democrats did not include the right of nations to self-determination directly in their program, they did, nevertheless, allow the demand for national independence to be advanced by sections of their party. In effect, this means, of course, the recognition of the right of nations to self-determination. Thus, Rosa Luxemburg's reference to Austria speaks against Rosa Luxemburg in all respects. End of chapter.